The man behind the chains. The morning sun rose over the red earth of South Africa, spilling its light across a small prison cell. Behind the narrow window, a man stood silently, gazing at a horizon he hadn't touched for nearly 3 decades. 27 years of stone walls, iron bars, and silence, yet the fire in his heart never dimmed. This man was Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. His story was not only the story of a leader, but of a people who longed for freedom in a land built on division. As a child, he lost his father, but from that grief came resilience. Even in his youth, he was different. While others played, he listened, absorbing the words of elders, sensing that justice was a word missing from his world. In his university years, the ugly face of apartheid revealed itself more clearly. He saw libraries barred to those with dark skin, sidewalks forbidden to his people, and a system designed to humiliate them at every turn. That was the moment he made his vow. This will not last. I will fight to change it. But choosing that path meant sacrifice. In the South Africa of the 1950s, asking for equality was close to asking for death. Yet Mandela never stepped back. What set him apart was not only his courage, but his willingness to give everything. He set aside his family, his comfort, even his freedom, because he knew one truth. When a people are bound in chains, personal peace means nothing. Still, his journey would not remain one of youthful ideals and promises. Blood would be spilled, betrayals would cut deep, and his resolve would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The first blow, the one that would define the rest of his life, was about to fall. A nation on trial. The streets of Johannesburg trembled under the weight of anger. Black South Africans marched with worn shoes and hungry faces, demanding nothing more radical than dignity. Police batons answered their voices, and the smell of tear gas became the air they breathed. Amid the chaos, one figure began to rise above the crowd, not as a soldier with weapons, but as a man with unshakable words. Mandela had become more than a lawyer. He had become a rallying cry. He knew the risks. Every speech he gave, every gathering he organized, painted a target on his back. Friends begged him to stop, to think of his wife and children. But Mandela's eyes carried the weight of a nation, and he refused to look away. He moved in shadows, meeting in secret rooms, planning strategies not with bullets, but with vision. And then came the inevitable. Raids, arrests, interrogations. Mandela became the enemy of the state. The apartheid regime decided he was too dangerous to be free. They put him on trial, a man standing against the full machinery of a government built on oppression. The courtroom was packed, journalists scribbling, soldiers guarding, the air thick with tension. Mandela stood tall, not as a defendant, but as a voice for millions. His words echoed through the walls. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Gasps filled the room. The government expected fear. Instead, they met defiance. Outside the courthouse, whispers spread across South Africa. Some believed Mandela would be executed. Others feared his voice would be silenced forever. Yet in that moment, something powerful happened. Mandela, the man in chains, became Mandela, the symbol. But symbols are dangerous to regimes built on fear. And so the government made its move. Mandela would not face the gallows, but something perhaps even worse. The Island of Silence. The boat cut across the dark waters toward a barren island, waves slapping against its steel hull. Shackled and surrounded by guards, Mandela looked toward the jagged rocks of Robben Island, knowing this was no temporary sentence. He was being erased, locked away, not for months or years, but for a lifetime. The cell they gave him was barely wide enough for a bedroll on the floor, the blanket thin, the walls damp with cold. By day, he was sent to the limestone quarries, swinging a pickaxe under the relentless African sun until his eyes burned and his lungs filled with dust. By night, the silence pressed in, broken only by the sound of distant chains. The regime's plan was simple: break his body, crush his spirit, and let the world forget his name. But they underestimated him. Each blow of the hammer, each blister on his hands became a prayer for freedom. Each sunrise over the island was another reminder that the fight was not over. He taught fellow prisoners in whispers, turning a prison yard into a classroom. He smuggled letters, each one a spark of hope that escaped the island's walls. He endured humiliation, guards forcing him to dig, to kneel, to obey, but inside his heart, a single word grew louder: freedom. And yet, freedom was still far away. The years stretched into decades. Children who once marched with his name grew into adults without ever seeing him free. The world began to ask, was Mandela still alive? But the answer lay in the unlikeliest of places, inside the very men assigned to guard him. Some of those guards, hardened by hate, began to notice something unsettling. The prisoner in cell 466-64 did not curse them, did not bow, did not break. Instead, he carried himself like a president, waiting for his inauguration. And slowly, even his captors began to whisper, "This man is different. This man is dangerous, not because he hates us, but because he refuses to." A voice that could not be silenced. The years dragged on, yet the name Mandela refused to vanish. From the dusty streets of Soweto to the concert halls of London, 3 simple words echoed across the globe: Free Nelson Mandela. In South Africa, the apartheid government insisted he was just another prisoner, a criminal locked away for disrupting order. But outside those walls, Mandela became a legend. His face, though hidden behind bars, appeared on posters, banners, and whispered prayers. His silence had become louder than the regime's lies. Musicians sang his name. Students carried his photo in marches. World leaders spoke his cause in parliaments. The prison cell meant to bury him. Instead, turned him into a beacon. Every day he remained behind bars, the injustice of apartheid became harder for the world to ignore. Inside Robben Island, he heard fragments of the outside world. Songs smuggled on radios, letters smuggled through cracks in the system. They told him that his people had not forgotten him, that millions were now marching in his name. The man who was supposed to disappear had instead become immortal. And yet, the cost was unbearable. His children grew without him. His marriage crumbled under the weight of distance and struggle. Friends were tortured, killed, or exiled. Freedom for his people grew nearer, but at a devastating personal price. The apartheid government faced a choice: keep Mandela locked away and risk turning him into a saint, or release him and risk igniting a revolution. Neither option promised safety. Both promised change. The world watched, waiting for a crack in the walls of Robben Island. And deep inside his cell, Mandela prepared not for survival, but for leadership. Because he knew when those iron doors finally opened, he would not return as just a man. He would return as the voice of a nation. The long walk to freedom, the gates of Victor Verster prison, creaked open on a warm February morning in 1990. A hush fell over the crowd gathered outside, thousands of voices holding a single breath. For 27 years, they had waited, whispered, prayed for this moment. And then, there he was. Nelson Mandela stepped into the sunlight, tall, calm, unbroken. His hair had grayed, his body aged, but his presence was larger than life. He raised his fist, not in anger, but in defiance and dignity. The crowd erupted. Tears streamed down faces worn by decades of oppression. Strangers embraced as if the whole nation had been freed in that single gesture. Around the world, television screens flickered with the same image. A man once condemned as a terrorist walking free, hailed now as the father of his people. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Mandela's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He had dreamed of this day in a cold cell, chiseling hope into stone. Now that dream had stepped into reality. The streets of Cape Town overflowed with celebration. Songs rang out, fists raised, flags waved. Children perched on their parents' shoulders to catch a glimpse of history passing before them. To the oppressed, Mandela's walk was not just a release. It was proof that chains, no matter how heavy, could be broken. But freedom was not yet victory. South Africa was a land divided by scars too deep for a single day to heal. Violence still simmered in the townships, and the regime still clung desperately to power. Mandela's release was the beginning of another battle, one fought not with fists or flames, but with patience, wisdom, and forgiveness. Still, that day would never be forgotten, for the world had witnessed something rare, a man who stepped out of prison, not seeking revenge, but offering reconciliation. And in that moment, Nelson Mandela became more than a symbol. He became the embodiment of hope itself. Building a nation from the ashes, South Africa, in the early 1990s, was a nation standing on a knife's edge. The walls of apartheid had begun to crumble, but beneath the cracks lay years of blood, hatred, and fear. For many, Mandela's release was not enough. Some wanted vengeance, others clung desperately to privilege. The streets pulsed with rallies, strikes, and gunfire. A single spark could ignite civil war. And into that storm walked Nelson Mandela, not with weapons, but with words, not with fury, but with resolve. He sat at tables with men who had once called for his execution. He shook hands with generals who had ordered his people beaten. To his supporters, it was unthinkable. How can you forgive them? To his enemies, it was disarming. Why does he not seek revenge? Mandela's answer was simple yet profound. Because South Africa could not survive without reconciliation. He knew that if the oppressed rose in anger and the oppressors clung to fear, the nation would burn. But if they met in the middle, scarred though they were, there was a chance for rebirth. In 1994, that chance became reality. South Africans of every color lined up at polling stations, some for hours, some for days, to cast their first free vote. The air was electric, heavy with disbelief and joy. For the first time, the ballot belonged to everyone, and when the results came, the impossible became truth. Nelson Mandela was the first black president of South Africa. His inauguration was more than a political ceremony. It was a resurrection. Leaders from around the globe gathered in Pretoria, but the true audience was the people who had waited generations for this day. Mandela stood at the podium, his voice steady. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another. The world cheered, the people wept, and South Africa, scarred and fragile, began to believe that healing was possible. But even as the nation celebrated, Mandela knew his greatest test still lay ahead. Leading a country from prison was one thing. Leading it into peace would demand something even greater. The weight of a nation, the presidential palace in Pretoria, gleamed with history. Yet when Nelson Mandela walked through its doors in 1994, the weight he carried was heavier than any crown. He was not simply a president, he was the bridge between centuries of division and the fragile dream of unity. The task was immense. The economy was broken, violence still festered in the townships, and trust between races was paper-thin. Some of his own supporters grew impatient, demanding swift justice against those who had upheld apartheid. Others feared that a black president would mean revenge. Mandela had to hold both sides together, as if balancing a nation in the palm of his hand. He chose forgiveness as his weapon. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where victims of apartheid told their stories and perpetrators confessed their crimes. It was painful, raw, and imperfect, but it prevented the nation from tearing itself apart. Mandela believed that truth was the only path to healing, even if it reopened wounds. His leadership style was unlike anything the world had seen. He embraced those who had once oppressed him, invited his jailers to his inauguration, and wore the Springbok rugby jersey, the symbol of white South Africa, during the 1995 World Cup. That single act transformed a game into a moment of unity, binding a divided nation under one flag. But the cost of leadership was personal. He was often exhausted, his health strained, his family life fractured. He had spent his youth in prison and his elder years in politics. He had given South Africa everything: his time, his freedom, his peace. Yet the world watched in awe. To millions, Mandela was no longer just a president. He was a living symbol of courage, sacrifice, and hope. Awards, honors, and global tributes poured in, but he wore them lightly, always reminding others that the struggle had never been about him. It had always been about the people. And as his first term neared its end, Mandela made a decision that stunned many. He would not run again. In a continent where power was often clung to until death, he chose to step aside. His message was clear. True leadership is not about holding power, but about passing it on. But even as he prepared to leave office, the question loomed: what legacy would he leave behind? And would the nation he had freed be strong enough to stand without him? The legacy of a giant. When Nelson Mandela stepped down from the presidency in 1999, the world braced itself. Could South Africa move forward without the man who had carried it through its most fragile years? But Mandela's departure was not an end, it was a lesson. He showed the world that true leadership meant knowing when to let go. Though no longer in office, he never faded into silence. He became a global elder, traveling from continent to continent, raising his voice for peace, justice, and equality. From combating HIV/AIDS in Africa to calling for reconciliation in war-torn regions, Mandela transformed from a national hero into a citizen of the world. His smile, his calm voice, his unwavering dignity. He had become the moral compass of humanity. Yet even giants are mortal. As the years passed, his steps slowed, his health weakened. Still, whenever he appeared in public, the air shifted. Crowds erupted, not with the frenzy of politics, but with the reverence reserved for saints. Children reached out to touch his hand. Elders wept at the sight of him. He had become something greater than a leader. He was hope, embodied in human form. On December the 5th, 2013, the news broke. Nelson Mandela had passed away at the age of 95. A hush fell across the world. Cities lit up his face on their skylines, churches and mosques filled with prayers, and nations lowered their flags. Millions mourned, but it was not the mourning of despair. It was gratitude for a life that had reshaped history. At his memorial, leaders from every corner of the globe stood side by side, enemies, rivals, friends, united not by treaties or power, but by respect for one man. It was the ultimate symbol of what Mandela had fought for: unity in the face of division. And so his story closed, not with bitterness, but with light. Nelson Mandela, the boy who once played on dusty fields in Kunu, the prisoner who spent 27 years behind bars, the president who healed a nation, left behind a truth larger than himself, that forgiveness is stronger than hate, and that freedom is worth every sacrifice. Today, his footsteps still echo. In every march for justice, in every act of reconciliation, in every voice that dares to say, "Never again," Mandela lives on. Mandela reminded us of one eternal truth. Chains can be broken, hate can turn into forgiveness, and a nation can rise from its ashes. His story is not just South Africa's story, it is humanity's story. We are here to keep these silent heroes alive. If you want to be part of this journey, to carry the lessons of the past into the future. Subscribe now, because when their voices fall silent, it is us and it is you who must keep them alive.